the Agrippina sector collapsed into madness. Exactly 3 hours after the Great Rift tore the galaxy in half, communications died across 12 star systems instantly. The screams of 4 trillion citizens were silenced by the static of the warp. On the fortress world of Orestes, the sky did not just turn dark. It turned into a bruising wall of purple fire that rained blood and brass onto the cathedrals below. The orbital defense platforms tried to fire, but their machine spirits were corrupted by scrap code that made the guns weep black oil instead of firing shells. Ships in the void drifted aimlessly because their navigators had their minds burned out by the sudden psychic shockwave. There was no hope. There was only the laughter of thirsting gods echoing from the tear in reality. The planetary governor of Orestes watched from his spire as a tide of demons materialized in the streets. He put his service pistol to his head. He knew help was not coming. The Imperium was too slow. The bureaucracy of terror would take 50 years just to read the distress signal. But the signal never reached terror. It was intercepted by something else, deep inside the turbulent energy of the warp, where logic dissolves and physics breaks. A second tear opened. This was not a wound made by chaos. It was surgical. It was precise. 2 distinct signatures punched through the wall of reality with the force of a supernova. The first signature was a blinding gold light that felt heavy and ancient, like the weight of law itself. The second signature was a complex geometric web of orange sparks that spun with mathematical perfection. They did not drift like ships. They fell like hammers. The Chaos fleet surrounding Orestes detected the energy spike. The demon ships, living vessels made of meat and iron, recoiled. They felt a frequency they detested. They felt order. The demons on the surface stopped their slaughter. They looked up at the burning sky. For the first time in the history of the Long War, the creatures of the warp felt hesitation. Lord Inquisitor Kolsch stood on the bridge of the only surviving loyalist cruiser, the Emperor's Mercy. He was old, tired, and his skin was grey from radiation sickness. He watched the viewing screens. The sensor officers shouted confused reports. They said the energy readings were impossible. They said the 2 falling stars registered as psychic events, but they carried no taint of the warp. Kolsch did not believe them. In the 41st millennium, there is no such thing as benevolent magic. Every sorcerer is a doorway for monsters. Every witch is a ticking bomb. Kolsch watched the 2 lights slam into the ruins of Hive City Primus on the surface of Orestes. The impact was silent in the void, but the sensors showed a shockwave that flattened 10 square miles of ruins. Dust rose into the stratosphere. Kolsch made his choice. He did not wait to see if the visitors were friendly. He did not ask if they were here to save the planet. The Imperium survives because it takes no risks. It survives because it kills the unknown before the unknown can speak. He turned to the gunnery master. He ordered a full orbital bombardment on the impact site. He ordered the ship to fire cyclonic torpedoes. The crew hesitated. They saw the golden light pushing back the purple storm clouds below. It looked like a miracle. Kolsch shot the gunnery master in the head. He repeated the order. The crew obeyed. The torpedoes launched. They streaked down toward the 2 strangers who had just arrived in hell. The Inquisitor recorded the time in his log. He noted that he had successfully engaged a new Xenos threat. He did not know that he had just declared war on the Sorcerer Supreme and the Lord of Order. The torpedoes hit the atmospheric layer and began to burn. The history of the sector turned a page. The war for the soul of the galaxy had just become much more complicated. The fire from the cyclonic torpedoes did not stop burning for 6 hours. The chemical agents in the warheads were designed to strip oxygen from the atmosphere and melt ferrocrete into slag. The heat was intense enough to boil the blood of anyone standing within 10 miles of the impact zone. On the bridge of the Emperor's Mercy, Lord Inquisitor Kolsch watched the thermal readings. The sensors reported a flat landscape of molten glass. He nodded to his servo-skull scribe. He dictated that the Zenith threat had been neutralized. He was wrong. Down in the center of the crater, the air rippled with heat, but the ground was cool. A perfect sphere of golden energy hummed with a low, resonant tone. Inside the sphere, the ground was untouched. The ancient Gothic ruins of the Hive City sector were preserved in a circle exactly 50 meters wide. Stephen Strange lowered his hands. The shield of the Seraphim faded. He looked at the devastation outside the circle. He saw an ocean of liquid fire. He saw the sky choking on black smoke. He looked at his companion. Dr. Fate hovered inches above the ground. The golden helmet of Nabu showed no emotion, but the cape drifted, as if caught in a wind that did not exist. Strange asked where they were. He asked why the geometry of the dimensions felt bruised. Fate did not answer immediately. The Lord of Order turned his head slowly, scanning the horizon. Fate spoke. He said the laws of physics here were tired. He said reality was thin, like fabric stretched over a screaming mouth. They began to move. Strange attempted to open a sling ring portal. He visualized the Sanctum Sanctorum in New York. He focused his will. Sparks flew from his hand, but they did not form a circle. They turned green and hissed. They smelled like rotting meat. The sparks bit his skin and vanished. Strange stared at his hand. He felt a presence watching him from the ether. It was not the Vishanti. It was something hungry. He realized that teleportation was dangerous here. The space between places was occupied. They would have to walk. Fate extended a hand. A golden Ankh symbol manifested and pushed the toxic smoke away. They created a tunnel of clean air through the burning city. They walked out of the crater and into the ruins of Orestes. The architecture confused Strange. He saw buildings that looked like cathedrals but functioned like factories. He saw gargoyles armed with heavy machine guns. He saw skulls carved into every surface. The scale was oppressive. Everything was built to make a human feel small. They found the first bodies 3 miles from the impact zone. They were not soldiers. They were workers. They wore grey rags. They had been crushed by falling debris. Strange knelt to examine a corpse. He noted the malnutrition. He noted the scars from repetitive labor. He noted the devotional tattoo of a double-headed eagle on the dead man's forehead. Strange tried to use the eye of Agamotto to see the man's past. He wanted to understand what killed him. The eye opened. Usually, it showed a stream of time. Here, it showed only a wall of static and pain. The soul of the man was gone. It had not moved on to an afterlife. It had been dissolved. Strange closed the eye. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. They heard the sound of gunfire to the north. It was the rhythmic thud of heavy caliber weapons. Strange and Fate moved toward the sound. They flew over the wreckage of a manufactorum. Below them, they saw a trench line. It was filled with muddy water and desperate men. These were the remnants of the Orestian 44th Planetary Defense Force. They were commanded by Captain Vorian. Vorian was missing an eye. His uniform was stained with promethium and blood. He was shouting orders to his men. They were firing laser guns at a wave of cultists charging across the rubble. The cultists were screaming unintelligible prayers. They were draped in human skin. They did not take cover. They ran directly into the laser fire, laughing as they burned. Strange watched the tactical situation. The defenders were low on ammunition. Their morale was breaking. The cultists were being driven by something larger. Behind the wave of infantry, a vehicle engine roared. A rhino personnel carrier, painted the dark red of dried blood, smashed through a wall. It bore the 8-pointed star of chaos. Strange decided to intervene. He did not ask for permission. He flew down between the trenches and the charging horde. He raised his hands. The crimson bands of Sitarak manifested. Red energy ribbons lashed out and wrapped around the leading cultists. The bands tightened. The cultists were immobilized. Strange swung his arms and the cultists were thrown back into the rhino with the force of a cannonball. The vehicle flipped over. Strange turned to the trench line. He expected gratitude. He expected the soldiers to cheer. He lowered his altitude and hovered before Captain Vorian. He introduced himself as Dr. Strange. He said he was there to help. Captain Vorian did not smile. The captain looked at the floating man in the blue robes. He looked at the glowing amulet. He looked at the red cloak that moved on its own. In the Imperium, there is only one name for a man who wields the power of the warp without a sanctioning collar. Witch. Vorian raised his bolt pistol. He did not hesitate. He recited the litany of witch hunting. He pulled the trigger. The bolt shell was a miniature rocket. It accelerated toward Strange's chest. Strange was surprised by the speed of the projectile. He barely raised the Tau Mandan's shield in time. The bolt hit the shield and detonated. The explosion pushed Strange backward. He was unhurt, but the shield shattered. The soldiers in the trench screamed in terror. They opened fire with everything they had. Last beams snapped through the air. Heavy bolters chugged, sending explosive rounds tearing up the ground around the Sorcerer Supreme. Strange flew up, dodging the fire. He was baffled. He shouted that he was on their side. The soldiers screamed louder. They called him a servant of the archenemy. They called him a demon host. Dr. Fate descended. He did not dodge. He simply made himself dense. The last beams hit his golden armor and reflected harmlessly. Fate understood what Strange did not. Fate saw the minds of the soldiers. He saw a culture built entirely on fear. He saw that their hatred was a survival mechanism. If they trusted a witch, they would be executed by their own commissars. Fate knew that diplomacy was impossible. He raised his hand. He did not strike the men. He struck their weapons. A pulse of geometric order expanded from his palm. It washed over the trench. The laser guns stopped working. The power packs were drained instantly. The firing pins in the bolt pistols fused. The machine spirits of the heavy weapons went silent. The shooting stopped. The silence that followed was terrified. The soldiers dropped their useless weapons. They fell to their knees. They began to pray to the God Emperor for deliverance. They believed their souls were being harvested. Strange landed next to Fate. He asked why the soldiers were attacking them. Fate explained that in this universe, ignorance was a virtue. He said that knowledge was considered a vector for corruption. Strange looked at the cowering men. He felt pity. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a ration bar. He offered it to a young soldier who was shaking in the mud. The soldier looked at the food. He looked at Strange. The soldier spat in Strange's face. He shouted that he would not eat the fruit of the warp. Before Strange could react, the ground shook. The flipped rhino carrier exploded outward. A massive shape rose from the burning wreckage. It was a hellbrute. This was a walking sarcophagus of twisted metal and flesh, housing the broken body of a Chaos Space Marine. The machine was 12 feet tall. It had a multi-melter gun on one arm and a massive power scourge on the other. It roared. The sound was not mechanical. It was the scream of a tortured soul amplified by vox grills. The hellbrute saw the two floating figures. Its targeting logic identified them as high-level threats. It ignored the guardsmen. It charged Strange. Strange saw the creature coming. He recognized the fusion of biology and technology, but it was wrong. The flesh was eating the metal. The metal was bleeding. It was a violation of natural law. Strange cast the bolts of Balthak. 3 lightning strikes hit the Hellbrute. The electricity arched over the hull. In his own universe, this would have stunned the tank. Here, the Hellbrute absorbed the energy. The Chaos runes etched into its armor glowed brighter. The warp ate the magic and grew stronger. The Hellbrute fired its multi-melter. A beam of superheated fusion energy cut the air. Strange teleported 5 meters to the left. The beam vaporized a concrete pillar behind him. The Hellbrute swung its power scourge. The lashed metal whips cracked the sound barrier. Strange was fast, but the creature was unnaturally fast. One of the whips caught Strange's ankle. He was slammed into the ground. The impact cracked the pavement. Strange gasped. His personal shields flickered. The Hellbrute raised a massive foot to crush him. Dr. Fate intervened. Fate did not use energy blasts. He used telekinesis. He gripped the Hellbrute with invisible hands. He lifted the 10-ton machine into the air. The Hellbrute thrashed. Its engine howled. Fate spoke a single word of binding. He attempted to seal the entity, but the Hellbrute was not just a machine. It was possessed. The demon inside the metal fought back. Fate felt a psychic backlash. The mind of the demon was a swirling abyss of rage. It tried to infect Fate's helmet. Nabu resisted. The struggle was metaphysical. The gold light of Fate clashed with the red static of the warp. The air around them began to bleed. Reality fractures appeared. Strange recovered. He saw Fate struggling. He realized their standard magic was behaving unpredictably. The ambient energy of this universe was hostile. He needed to be physical. He conjured the axe of Angarumus. He flew upward and dove at the suspended Hellbrute. He swung the mystic axe. The blade cleaved through the sarcophagus plate. It severed the connection between the pilot and the machine. Black blood sprayed across the ruins. The machine went limp. Fate dropped it. The Hellbrute crashed to the ground, dead. The victory was absolute. Strange landed, breathing hard. He wiped the black blood from his tunic. He turned to the guardsmen, expecting that now, surely, they would see he was an ally. He saw Captain Vorian holding a grenade. The captain had pulled a pin. He was weeping. He was whispering a prayer for the Emperor to take his soul. He believed that the 2 wizards had killed the monster only to claim the kill for themselves. He believed he was about to be sacrificed to a dark god. He ran towards Strange, intending to detonate the grenade in a suicide attack. Strange froze. He was a doctor. He had taken an oath to do no harm. He saw a man trying to kill him out of pure, distilled fear. Strange did not blast him. He used the images of Icon. Suddenly, 100 duplicates of Strange appeared. Vorian was confused. He stopped. He didn't know which one to bomb. He spun around, screaming. The grenade timer clicked. Strange used a small portal. He opened a hole in space right next to the grenade in Vorian's hand. The grenade fell through the hole. A second portal opened 500 feet in the air. The grenade exploded harmlessly in the sky. Vorian collapsed. The adrenaline failed him. He curled into a ball in the mud. Strange dispelled the images. He walked over to the captain. He knelt down. He checked the man's pulse. It was racing. Strange looked at Fate. He said this world was insane. Fate nodded. Fate said the insanity was structural. It was not a localized event. The entire galaxy was built on this terror. Suddenly, the sky tore open again. This time, it was not a golden light. It was a drop-bod assault. The clouds churned as black pods streaked down from orbit. They were not Imperial. They were covered in spikes. They belonged to the Word-Bearer's traitor legion. The Chaos Fleet had moved into low orbit. They had detected the psychic flare of the battle with the Hellbrute. They were sending a hunting party. Strange stood up. He looked at the falling pods. There were dozens of them. Each one carried a squad of Chaos Space Marines. These were super soldiers enhanced by dark magic, veterans of a war that had lasted 10,000 years. Strange looked at the terrified guardsmen. If he left, they would be butchered. If he stayed, he would be fighting an army. He looked at the ruined city. He realized that there was no police coming. There were no Avengers. There was only the mud, the blood, and the choice to stand or run. Fate floated beside him. Fate stated the probability of survival if they remained was 12%. Strange tightened his cloak. He said he liked those odds. He began to weave a spell of fortification. He pulled rocks from the ground to build a wall. He set wards of protection around the trench line. The guardsmen watched him. They did not understand. They still feared him, but they did not run. They saw the black pods landing in the distance. They heard the war horns of the traitors. They checked their power packs, which Fate had silently recharged. The first drop pod hit the ground 3 blocks away. The doors blasted open. 5 word-bearers stepped out. Their armor was dark red, inscribed with glowing runes. They carried bolters the size of anvils. Their leader, a dark apostle, held a cursed Crozius that radiated corruption. He pointed at the golden light of Strange's shield. He ordered his men to claim the new power for the dark gods. Strange looked at the oncoming giants. He felt the fatigue of the dimension travel. He felt the wrongness of the magic here. He knew this fight would be different. These enemies were not mindless beasts. They were strategic. They were disciplined. And they knew the nature of the warp better than he did. The Dark Apostle began to chant. The reality around the word-bearers shifted. Shadows detached themselves from the walls and formed into lesser daemons. Strange realized he wasn't just fighting soldiers. He was fighting a theology weaponized into physics. The demons rushed forward, a carpet of teeth and claws. The word-bearers marched behind them, firing precise bolter shots at the shield. Strange held the barrier. The impacts were heavy. Each bolter shell that hit the shield drained his stamina. He shouted to Fate. He needed a plan. Fate was looking at the sky. Fate saw the pattern of the invasion. He said they needed to disrupt the command frequency. He said the word-bearers were coordinating through a ritual signal. Fate began to counter-chant. He spoke the language of ancient order, a tongue that predated the Imperium by millions of years. The effect was violent. The Dark Apostle choked. The demons flickered. Order was poison to them. The demons shrieked and dissolved into sludge. The word-bearers hesitated. Their connection to the warp was being jammed. For a second, they were just men in heavy armor. Strange dropped the shield and switched to offense. He cast the 7 rings of Ragador. 7 circles of blue fire erupted under the word-bearers. The fire was hot, but it was also solid. It trapped them. But the word-bearers were Astartes. They did not panic. They activated their jump packs. They launched themselves into the air, escaping the rings. They descended on the trench line from above. Strange had to react fast. He flew up to meet them. He engaged in hand-to-hand combat in the air. He used his cloak to parry a chainsword. The teeth of the sword tore the fabric, but the cloak regenerated. Strange punched a word-bearer in the faceplate with a fist reinforced by magic. The ceramite cracked. The giant fell. On the ground, Captain Vorian saw the witch knock a traitor Astartes out of the sky. Vorian's worldview cracked. The witch was fighting the archenemy. The witch was saving his men. It was a heresy to accept the help, but it was suicide to refuse it. Vorian made a pragmatic choice. He ordered his men to fire at the airborne targets. The guardsmen added their last fire to Strange's magic. The air filled with red beams and blue sparks. The battle raged for 20 minutes. It was brutal and close quarters. Strange took a glancing hit from a bolt round that broke his ribs. Fate's armor was scorched by plasma fire. But the word-bearers were pushed back. They had underestimated the power of the two strangers. They retreated to the ruins to regroup. They realized this was not a simple harvest. This was a new variable. As the smoke cleared, Strange landed again. He held his side. He was bleeding. He looked at Vorian. The captain did not raise his gun this time. He just stared. He asked what they were. Strange didn't answer with a title. He just said he was a doctor. He walked over to a wounded guardsman whose leg had been blown off. Strange knelt. He put his hands on the wound. He used the Eye of Agamotto to reverse the localized time of the injury. The flesh knit together, the bone reconnected. The leg was whole. The guardsman gasped. This was not just power. This was a miracle. But in the 41st millennium, miracles are suspect. The healed soldier looked at his leg in horror. He touched it. It was real. He looked at Strange with a mix of awe and terror. He asked if Strange was a saint. Strange shook his head. He stood up. He looked at the sky. The Chaos Fleet was still there. The Imperium fleet was gone or destroyed. They were stranded. Fate floated down. He said the timeline here was rigid. He said that small actions would trigger massive responses. He said that by saving these men, they had altered the destiny of the sector. Strange asked if that was good. Fate said it was irrelevant. He said that order required balance. And in this galaxy, the only balance was war. Strange looked at the horizon. He saw more drop pods falling. He saw the fires of the Hive City burning brighter. He realized this was just the first hour of the first day. He realized he couldn't just leave. He had to fix this. But he didn't know if this universe could be fixed. He only knew that the surgery would be long, and the patient might not survive the cure. Far above in orbit, aboard the Chaos Grand Cruiser Terminus Est, a sorcerer of the Death Guard watched the viewing globe. He saw the blue and gold lights repelling the word bearers. He saw the healing of the flesh. He wheezed a wet, phlegm-filled laugh. He tapped a communication rune. He opened a channel to the warp. He whispered a message to the plague god. He said that there were new ingredients on the table. He said that the stagnation of the Long War was about to break. He ordered his plague marines to prepare for deployment. The word bearers had failed with brute force. The Death Guard would try a different approach. They would test the immunity of these new doctors. They would see if the Sorcerer Supreme could cure a sickness that had no cure. On the ground, the wind picked up. It smelled of ozone and decay. Strange and Fate stood back to back, surrounded by the men they had saved, looking out into the darkness of the 41st millennium. They were the most powerful mystics of their own reality. Here, they were just two sparks in a hurricane. The night had only just begun. The silence that followed the retreat of the word bearers was not peaceful. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet that pressed down on the lungs of the 300 surviving guardsmen. They huddled in the ruins of the Manufactorum, surrounded by the cooling slag of the battle. The euphoria of survival had lasted less than an hour. It was replaced by the crushing reality of logistics in the 41st millennium. There was no resupply coming. The water tanks in the trench line had been ruptured by bolter fire. The medical supplies were exhausted. The promethium for the few remaining flamers was critically low. Dr. Strange sat on a block of crumbling ferrocrete. He was attempting to conjure water. In his own reality, this was a trivial spell. a parlor trick he could perform while sleeping. Here, it was a negotiation with a hostile universe. He visualized clear, cold water. He shaped the mana. A small stream of liquid manifested in the air and fell into a waiting jerrycan. The soldiers watched with hungry eyes. Strange stopped. The water was not clear. It was slightly viscous. It smelled of sulfur. He tasted a drop. It was acidic. The warp had tainted the conjuration. Strange banished the liquid with a wave of his hand. He looked at the disappointed faces of the men. He realized that the fundamental fabric of this dimension resented creation. It only favored destruction. Dr. Fate stood atop the highest remaining wall. He was motionless. His golden helm reflected the burning skyline of Orestes. He was not looking at the physical battlefield. He was observing the noosphere and the psychic currents of the orbit. He detected the presence of the Mechanicus, a strictly neutral scout ship. The Omnissiah's eye was holding station in the debris field. It was watching Fate. It was scanning the geometry of his helmet with greedy, binary intensity. Fate calculated the probability of Mechanicus aid. It was 0. They were recording the data of the anomalies for study. If the doctors died, the Mechanicus would descend to salvage their corpses. Fate shifted his attention to the Imperial cruiser. The Emperor's mercy was repositioning. Lord Inquisitor Kolsch was not fleeing. He was establishing a firing solution. Fate understood the strategic logic. The Inquisitor viewed the survival of Vorian's company as a contagion risk. To the Imperium, a soldier who fights alongside a witch is already lost. Fate descended to the ground. He told Strange that they were being targeted by the people they were trying to save. Strange argued. He said they should open a portal to the ship and explain themselves. Fate countered that the Inquisitor would simply purge the bridge crew and self-destruct the vessel to prevent corruption. Logic did not apply here in the way Strange understood it. The conversation was cut short by the sound of bells. It was a low, mournful tolling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It vibrated in the teeth of the men. A thick, yellow fog began to roll over the ruins of the trench line. It moved against the wind. It smelled of wet earth, spoiled meat, and old hospitals. The temperature dropped, but the humidity spiked. The flies came next. They were large, black, and bloated. They buzzed in a drone that sounded like whispered prayers. Captain Vorian rallied his men. His voice was cracked from dehydration. He ordered masks on. The guardsmen fumbled with their equipment. Many of their gas masks were cracked or had clogged filters. They wrapped rags around their faces. Vorian looked at Strange. The captain's eyes were filled with a grim acceptance. He knew what the bells meant. He told Strange that the Death Guard had come. He explained in short, terrified sentences what that meant. The word-bearers wanted to sacrifice them. The Death Guard wanted to infect them. Vorian checked his bolt pistol. He had 2 rounds left. He saved 1 for the enemy. He saved the last one for himself. The fog thickened. Shapes emerged from the mist. They were not running. They were shambling. Hundreds of poxwalkers, civilians who had been exposed to the destroyer plague, lumbered forward. Their bodies were distended, covered in weeping sores and horn-like growths. They moaned in a chorus of agony. Behind them marched the plague marines of the Death Guard. They were massive, hulking figures in corroded green power armor. Their ceramide plates were cracked, leaking pus and oil. They carried bolters that dripped with slime. They did not shout battle cries. They marched in a silent, inexorable rhythm, keeping time with the ghostly bells. Strange stepped forward. He felt a wave of nausea. The magical energy radiating from the Death Guard was not aggressive like the word-bearers. It was passive, deep, and overwhelmingly toxic. It felt like the heat death of the universe. Strange raised his hands. He cast the winds of Watum to blow the fog away. A gust of magical wind roared through the ruins. The fog swirled, parted for a moment, and then immediately snapped back, heavier than before. The magic was dampened. The entropy of Nurgle absorbed the kinetic energy and converted it into lethargy. Strange felt his arms grow heavy. A sudden fatigue washed over him. He realized this was not just a biological attack. It was a spiritual depression weaponized into a physical field. The first wave of poxwalkers hit the perimeter. The guardsmen opened fire. Last beams burned holes in rotting flesh, but the creatures did not stop. They felt no pain. A poxwalker, with half its head blown off, dragged the screaming guardsman over the barricade. The soldier's screams turned wet and gurgling as he was bitten. Strange flew into the fray. He used the crimson bands again, but this time he did not bind them. He used the bands as whips, shearing through the undead mass. He decapitated a dozen walkers in seconds, but for every one he killed, 2 more stood up. The bodies on the ground began to bloat and burst, releasing clouds of spores. Dr. Fate analyzed the pathogen. The helmet of Nabu processed the biological data. It was impossible. The virus mutated every nanosecond. It rewrote the DNA of the host to accept the warp. Fate realized that physical combat was inefficient. He needed to sterilize the area. He raised both hands. A geometric grid of pure white light appeared on the ground, covering the front line of the enemy. Fate enacted a rite of purification. The grid flared. The poxwalkers inside the grid caught fire. The fire was clean and smokeless. It burned the rot away. The Death Guard reacted. A sorcerer of Nurgle, clad in a tattered robe over his Terminator armor, stepped forward. He held a staff topped with a rusting icon of 3 circles. He saw Fate's light. He did not cast a spell to counter it. He simply laughed. He pointed his staff at the grid. He invoked the concept of inevitable decay. He whispered to the universe that all things must end, even light. The white grid flickered. It turned a sickly green. The purification fire died. The spell decayed in front of Fate's eyes. The energy structure rusted and collapsed into dust. Fate staggered. The feedback loop was intense. He had pitted absolute order against absolute entropy, and entropy had the home field advantage. The Plague Marines opened fire. Their bolter rounds were not explosive. They were filled with acid and bioactive sludge. A round hit a guardsman next to Strange. The man didn't just die. He liquefied. His armor dissolved. His flesh melted off his bones in seconds. The horror of it froze the defenders. This was not war. This was extermination. Strange saw a young medic trying to drag a wounded comrade to safety. A Plague Marine targeted them. Strange teleported, interposing himself. He raised a shield of the Seraphim. The sludge round splashed against the mandala. The shield hissed. The golden energy began to corrode. Strange watched in disbelief as mold grew on his magic shield. The mystical construct was rotting. Strange realized they were losing the attrition war. He needed to do something decisive. He needed to cure the plague itself. He believed that if he could reverse the infection in the vanguard, he could break the psychic hold of the Death Guard. He targeted the poxwalkers. He flew above them. He reached for the eye of Agamotto. He opened the locket. The green glow of the time stone illuminated the fog. Strange focused on the concept of reversion. He wanted to turn back the biological clock of the victims to a point before the infection took hold. He unleashed the spell. Time rippled. For a second it worked. The sores on the poxwalkers vanished. The distended limbs snapped back. The cloudy eyes cleared. 1,000 zombies became 1,000 confused, terrified citizens of the Imperium. They looked at their hands. They began to weep. Strange smiled. He had done it. Then the universe corrected him. The warp god Nurgle is the god of life as well as death. He loves his creations. He does not let them go. The cured citizens screamed. The virus had not been erased. It had been insulted. It reacted with intelligent malice. The cure created a vacuum that the warp rushed to fill. The bodies of the cured citizens did not just reinfect. They mutated instantly into something worse. Their flesh expanded rapidly, bursting out of their clothes. They fused together, mass to mass, forming a wall of writhing, screaming meat. The Time Stone's energy was consumed and repurposed to accelerate the growth. Strange watched in horror as the people he tried to save became a towering abomination, a spawn of chaos the size of a building. The spawn lashed out with a tentacle made of human spines. It swatted Strange out of the air. He crashed into the ruins, his cloak tearing on rebar. He coughed blood. The physical impact was nothing compared to the psychological blow. He had made it worse. His hope had been used as fuel for the horror. Captain Vorian saw the spawn. He saw his men breaking. They were throwing down their guns and curling into fetal positions, waiting to die. Vorian grabbed a voxcaster. He screamed at the Inquisitor in orbit. He begged for a bombardment. He called down fire on his own position. He gave the coordinates. Broken arrow. Purge us. Just kill this thing. Lord Inquisitor Kolsch, on the Emperor's mercy, heard the plea. He did not feel pity. He felt validation. The witches had lost control. The contamination was absolute. He granted the request. He ordered the lance batteries to fire. High above, the ship maneuvered. Massive energy capacitors charged. A lance strike is a focused beam of energy capable of punching through a Titan's void shields. Kolsch aimed it at the center of the defensive line. Fate saw the energy spike in orbit. He calculated the trajectory. The beam would hit in 4 seconds. It would vaporize everyone. The Death Guard, the Spawn, the Guardsman, and Strange. Fate made a choice. He could not stop the beam. He could not stop the plague. He could only change the geometry of the impact. He flew to the center of the courtyard. He did not raise a shield to block. He raised a shield to deflect. He angled a plane of hard light at 45 degrees. The lance beam struck. The sound was a thunderclap that shattered every window within 10 miles. The beam hit Fate's shield. The shield held for a microsecond, glowing brighter than the sun. Then the energy was deflected sideways. It sliced through the spawn of chaos, vaporizing the meat mountain instantly. It continued, carving a trench through the Death Guard lines, turning a dozen plague marines into ash. The shockwave flattened the guardsmen, burying them in dust. Fate fell from the air. His cape was burned away. His golden armor was smoking. The deflection had drained his reserves. The silence returned. The spawn was gone. The Death Guard had taken heavy losses from the friendly fire and the deflected beam. They paused. The Sorcerer of Nurgle looked at the smoking crater where his creation had been. He nodded slowly. He had tested the newcomers. He had forced the Imperium to fire on itself. It was a victory of morale. The Death Guard began to withdraw into the fog. They did not run. They simply faded back, leaving the infection to finish the job. Strange crawled out of the rubble. He limped over to Fate. Fate was standing up, but his movements were stiff. Strange looked around. Half the guardsmen were dead from the shockwave or the earlier fighting. The survivors were coughing. The air was still thick with spores. Strange looked at Vorian. The captain was staring at his voxcaster. He had just ordered his own death, and he had failed even at that. Strange went to a wounded soldier. The man's arm was turning black. Gangrene was setting in at a supernatural rate. Strange reached out to heal him. The soldier flinched away. "Don't," the soldier rasped. "Don't touch me. You'll make it a monster." Strange froze. The words cut deeper than any blade. He withdrew his hand. He realized he had lost their trust completely. He was not a savior here. He was a variable that caused escalation. Fate spoke. His voice was hollow. "We cannot stay here. The atmospheric toxicity is rising. The Inquisitor will fire again. He will use cyclonic torpedoes next time to ensure the job is done. We must move." "Where?" Strange asked. "Space is blockaded. The surface is a kill zone." "Down," Fate said. "The Underhive. The ancient ventilation shafts shield against orbital scans. The density of the rock will mask our energy signatures." Vorian stood up. He looked at his remaining men. 120 left out of 1,000. He looked at the doctors. He hated them. He hated them for coming here. He hated them for giving him hope. But he knew the Inquisitor had marked them all for death now. There was no going back to the fold. "Gather the supplies," Vorian said. His voice was dead. "We go deep." The retreat was a march of misery. They left the dead where they fell. They abandoned the heavily wounded who could not walk. There were no stretchers, and carrying them would slow the group enough to kill everyone. Strange had to walk past men who begged him for help. He had to ignore them. The logic of the 40K universe was setting in. Compassion was a luxury they could not afford. They found a bulkhead door leading to the sublevels. It was rusted shut. Strange cut it open with a magic reinforced gesture, not with flair, but with angry efficiency. They filed into the darkness. The air in the tunnels was stale and hot. It smelled of centuries of machine grease and human waste. As the last guardsman entered, Strange sealed the door behind them. He fused the metal. He placed a ward on it. They were in the dark now. The only light came from the lumiglobes on the guardsman's armor and the faint glow of the eye of Agamotto. Strange looked at his hands. They were trembling. He was the Sorcerer Supreme. He had bargained with Dormammu. He had fought Thanos. But here, against a silent, smiling plague, he felt incompetent. Fate walked beside him. "You attempted to impose a causality that does not exist here," Fate said. "You tried to cure. This reality does not allow for reversal. It only allows for endurance. I killed those people," Strange whispered. "The ones I tried to fix. The war predated your action," Fate stated cold logic. "They were dead the moment the fog touched them. You merely altered the method of their destruction. Do not waste energy on guilt. We have a tactical problem, which is, we are trapped in a labyrinth beneath a dying world," Fate said. "We have no food. We have no support. And the entity known as Tzeentch has just taken notice of us." Stranger looked at Fate. "Tzeentch, the architect of Fate," Fate replied. He felt the manipulation of the time stone. He felt the deflection of the lance beam. He enjoyed his complexity. The Death Guard was a hammer. Tzeentch is a scalpel. The next attack will not be on our bodies. It will be on our minds. Deep in the shadows of the tunnel ahead, something skittered. It sounded like metal claws on wet stone. The darkness seemed to breathe. The guardsmen clicked their safety catches off. They were tired. They were starving. They were irradiated. But they were still walking. Strange straightened his back. He forced the tremor in his hands to stop. He could not be the doctor right now. He had to be the soldier. He took point. He lit the tip of his finger with a small, steady flame. It wasn't much light, but it pushed back the dark a few feet. "Move out," Strange said. The column marched into the abyss. Above them, on the surface, The Death Guard claimed the ruins. They planted their banners in the piles of corpses. They began to brew their cauldrons. They were in no hurry. Decay takes time, and they had all the time in the world. In orbit, Inquisitor Kolsch slammed his fist onto the tactical table. The target was lost. The cogitators reported the energy signatures had vanished underground. He could not fire torpedoes without risking the destabilization of the planet's crust, which would destroy the promethium refineries he needed to secure. He had to go down there. He couldn't send the Guard. They were unreliable. He couldn't send the Navy. He needed specialists. He turned to the astropathic choir. He ordered them to send a message to the Titan moon of Titan. He needed the Grey Knights. He knew the request would take weeks, maybe months, but he was patient. He marked the coordinates of Orestes as condemned. He initiated the quarantine protocols. No ship leaves, no ship enters. He would starve the witches out. The second catastrophe was not the battle. The catastrophe was the realization that there was no winning. There was only prolonging the defeat. The story of Strange and Fate in the 41st Millennium had transitioned from a rescue mission to a survival horror, and in the dark of the Underhive, the walls began to whisper secrets that Doctor Strange was not ready to hear. The descent into the Underhive of Orestes took 14 standard terrestrial days. In that time, the company of Captain Vorian lost another 30 men. They did not die from enemy fire. They died from the environment. The darkness of the lower levels was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical weight. The air filtration systems of the Hive City had failed centuries ago in these sectors, leaving an atmosphere heavy with carbon monoxide and recycled toxins. The men marched in a stupor, their boots splashing through runoff water that glowed with weak phosphorescence. Hunger became the primary tactical concern. The ration packs were gone on day 4. Doctor Strange attempted to solve this with magic. He utilized the horn of Proteus to summon a banquet. In his reality, this would have been a feast of solid, nutritious matter. In the 40K universe, the spell manifested trays of meat and fruit that looked perfect, but when the soldiers bit into them, the food turned to grey ash in their mouths. The laws of this dimension demanded an equivalent exchange that Strange could not pay without sacrificing his own life force. The magic here was predatory. It refused to give sustenance without taking something of equal value. Strange was forced to resort to alchemy. He instructed the men to scrape fungus from the damp walls. He used the flames of the Faultine, dialed down to a microscopic level, to transmute the poisonous spores into a flavorless, nutrient-dense paste. It kept them alive, but it did not stop the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. Dr. Fate did not eat. He did not sleep. He floated at the rear guard, his helmet constantly scanning the geometry of the tunnels. He began to notice a disturbing pattern. The tunnels were not static. They were rearranging themselves. A corridor that led north would, after an hour of marching, somehow loop back to the south without ever turning. Stairs that appeared to go down would deposit them on a level higher than where they started. Fate recognized the signature. It was non-Euclidean geometry applied to physical architecture. It was the mark of Tzeentch. The architect of Fate was toying with them. The retreat was not being blocked. It was being steered. They were being herded like cattle toward a specific slaughterhouse. Fate calculated the probability of escaping the maze without a guide. The result was 0. He approached Strange. He spoke in the private telepathic frequency they shared. He warned Strange that their movement was an illusion. They were walking on a treadmill of reality. Strange stopped the column. He looked at the map Vorian was holding. The map was a useless piece of parchment. The ink was bleeding, forming shapes that looked like laughing faces. Vorian was staring at a wall of wet ferrocrete. He was muttering to himself. The captain's mind was fraying. He had seen demons, magic, and miracles, and none of it had saved his world. Strange placed a hand on Vorian's shoulder. The captain flinched. He looked at Strange with eyes that were yellowed from liver failure. He asked why they had stopped. Strange said they needed to find a path that wasn't there. Strange closed his physical eyes and opened the eye of Agamotto. He looked past the rock, past the material plane. He saw the layout of the hive not as stone but as a web of energy. He saw the deception. The tunnels were glamour. The real path was hidden behind a psychic veil. Strange raised his hands and performed the dispelling of Dagoth. He struck the solid wall in front of them. The rock shattered like glass. Behind the illusion was a massive blast door made of adamantium, stamped with the cog mechanicum of Mars. It was a seal. A quarantine zone within the quarantine zone. The soldiers raised their weapons. They feared what was behind the door more than what was behind them. Strange examined the lock. It was a logic engine, a puzzle of binary code and prayer. He could not pick it with magic. It required a data key. Fate stepped forward. He placed his golden hand on the interface. He spoke directly to the machine spirit of the door. He did not hack it. He overloaded it with pure order. He gave the machine the mathematical solution to pi. The machine spirit, overwhelmed by the perfection of the data, unlocked the mechanism in a paroxysm of binary ecstasy. The heavy gears ground open. They entered a vast chamber. It was a cathedral of machinery, a hidden excavation site of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The air here was cold and dry. In the center of the room stood a device the size of a hab block. It was a black obelisk, covered in silver circuitry that did not look imperial. It looked older. Dark age of technology. Suspended around the obelisk were the bodies of a dozen tech priests. They were not dead. They were in stasis. Their meshadendrites were plugged into the obelisk, acting as wetware processors. From the shadows of the machinery, a figure emerged. It was a Magos Dominus, a high-ranking lord of the machine cult. His lower half was a tread unit like a tank. His upper body was a mess of sensors, claws, and robes. He held a large power axe. He was accompanied by 2 Castellan robots, massive automata, with blank, faceless visors. The Magos did not attack immediately. He emitted a burst of binaric cant, a screech of static that hurt the ears of the guardsmen. Fate translated. The Magos was demanding to know why biological variables had intruded on the holy work. Strange stepped forward. He introduced himself as a man of science. He tried to appeal to the Magos' logic. He explained that they were refugees seeking shelter. The Magos processed this. His vocalizers clicked. He spoke in High Gothic, his voice a synthesized monotone. He identified Strange as a psyker of unknown classification. He identified Fate as a Xenos construct or a demon engine. He leveled his axe. He stated that the probability of them being threats to the Omnissiah's secret was 99.8%. He ordered the Castellan robots to initiate purge protocols. The robots charged. They were fast for their size. Their phosphor blasters spun up, glowing with burning white heat. Strange reacted instinctively. He cast the shields of the Seraphim. The phosphor rounds slammed into the shields, burning with an intensity that threatened to overload Strange's concentration. These were not bullets. They were white phosphorus projectiles that burned even in a vacuum. Strange shouted to Fate. He said they couldn't destroy the robots without damaging the facility. Fate agreed. Fate flew over the robots. He did not strike them. He landed on the head of the lead robot. He phased his hand through the ceramite armor and touched the Cortex controller wafer inside. He rewrote the command protocol. He changed the target designation from hostile to null. The robot stopped mid-stride. It powered down. The Magos was enraged. He saw this as tech heresy of the highest order. He unleashed a stream of arc-scourge electricity from his mecha dendrites. The lightning struck Strange, bypassing his magical defenses because it was grounded in physical laws Strange hadn't accounted for. Strange was thrown back, his nervous system seizing. The guardsmen opened fire on the Magos, but their last shots bounced off his refractor field. The Magos turned his attention to the soldiers. He activated a flamer unit. He was about to incinerate Vorian. Strange, lying on the floor, saw the danger. He couldn't cast a shield in time. He used the cloak of levitation. The cloak ripped itself from his shoulders and flew at the Magos. It wrapped around the tech priest's optical sensors. It tangled his weapon arms. The Magos thrashed, blinded. Strange scrambled to his feet. He cast the bolts of Balthak, but he didn't aim at the Magos. He aimed at the floor beneath the tread unit. The floor exploded. The Magos tipped over, his track spinning uselessly in the air. Strange stood over the fallen tech priest. He held the axe of Angarumus to the Magos' neck cables. He demanded a truce. The Magos froze. His logic engines calculated the outcome. Death. The Magos tipped over, his tracks spinning uselessly in the air. Strange stood over the fallen tech priest. He held the axe of Angarumus to the Magos' neck cables. He demanded a truce. The Magos froze. His logic engines calculated the outcome. Death was inefficient. Survival allowed for future data acquisition. The Magos ceased resistance. He retracted his weapons. He introduced himself as Magos 7 Sigma. He demanded to know how the intruder manipulated the motive force without prayer. Strange said it was study, not prayer. This intrigued the Magos. The truce was established. 7 Sigma explained the nature of the black obelisk. It was a null casket, a relic from the age before the Imperium. It was designed to suppress psychic energy. The Mechanicus had been studying it for 50 years, trying to reverse engineer it. But the Great Rift had damaged it. The casket was failing. That was why the warp was leaking into the planet. That was why the Death Guard could manifest. The dampening field was dying. Strange looked at the obelisk. He saw the cracks in the containment field. He realized that this machine was the only thing keeping Orestes from being completely swallowed by the warp. If it failed, the planet would become a demon world. Strange proposed a solution. He would use the Eye of Agamotto to reverse the entropy of the machine, to repair the cracks. Fate warned him. Fate said that the machine utilized null energy, which was the antithesis of magic. If Strange touched it with the time stone, the reaction could be catastrophic. It could create a signal flare. 7 Sigma did not care about the risk. He wanted the machine fixed. He offered a trade. If they fixed the null casket, he would open the deep-core maglev train that led to the polar spaceport. It was the only way off the continent. It was the only way to escape the Death Guard. Vorian begged Strange to do it. The captain saw a way out. He didn't care about the consequences. He just wanted to get his men to a ship. Strange agreed. He approached the obelisk. He felt the anti-magic field pushing against him. It made him feel sick, like his blood was turning to ice. He opened the eye. The green light of the time stone struggled against the black void of the machine. Strange focused. He grabbed the concept of the machine's structural integrity and pulled it backward in time. The reaction was immediate and violent. The obelisk screamed. It wasn't a sound. It was a psychic shockwave. The silver circuitry flared with blinding white light. The cracks in the black stone sealed. The machine hummed to life, stronger than it had been in 10,000 years. The psychic dampening field expanded outward at the speed of thought. On the surface, the effect was devastating. The yellow fog of the Death Guard evaporated instantly. The lesser demons, sustained by the ambient warp energy, flickered and vanished back to the Imperium. The Plague Marines felt their connection to Nurgle severed. They fell to their knees, suddenly feeling the weight of their rotting bodies without the anesthesia of their god. For a moment, the planet was clean. But fate's warning was correct. The interaction between an Infinity Stone and a Dark Age null device created a paradox. It sent a pulse through the Imperium. It was a beacon. It pierced the warp storm surrounding the system. It shone like a lighthouse in hell. In the eye of terror, Tzeentch smiled. The beacon was the signal he had been waiting for. He did not send an army. He sent a whispers. The pulse had weakened the barrier between the minds of the men in the room. Down in the chamber, the victory turned sour. The guardsmen began to scream. They clutched their heads. The sudden absence of the background warp noise, followed by the high-frequency hum of the null casket, shattered their fragile psyches. They started to see things. They saw their dead comrades. They saw their own sins. Captain Vorian pulled his bolt pistol. He pointed it at Strange. He didn't see Strange. He saw a demon wearing Strange's face. "Traitor!" Vorian screamed. "You brought us to the hell!" Strange tried to calm him. "Vorian, it's me. The field is working." "Lies," Vorian fired. The bolt round hit Strange's shield. Chaos erupted in the chamber. The guardsmen turned on each other. The stress of the last 3 weeks, combined with the psychic whiplash, broke them. It was a fratricide. Strange watched in horror as the men he had starved and bled for began to butcher one another. He tried to stop them with the bands of Sitorak, binding them in groups, but there were too many. Magos 7 Sigma did not help. He observed. He recorded the psychological failure of unaugmented biologicals. He signaled his Castellan robot to secure the obelisk. The robot raised its fists and smashed a cluster of fighting guardsmen into pace to clear a perimeter. Then the shadows detached themselves from the walls. Tzeentch had found a crack. The null casket suppressed raw warp energy, but it could not suppress the distinct intelligent manipulation of the Changer of Ways. Creatures made of iridescent fire, flamers of Tzeentch, poured out of the ventilation shafts. They were not summoned. They were waiting. They had been hiding in the machine's shadow. Fate engaged. He flew at the flamers. He used blasts of pure order to destabilize their forms. But for every one he destroyed, 2 pink horrors split off from the corpse. The room became a kaleidoscope of pink and blue fire. Strange was fighting on 2 fronts, restraining the mad guardsmen and battling the demons. "We must shut it down," Strange yelled to the Magos. "The beacon is attracting them." "Negative," 7 Sigma droned. "The asset is functional. Defense protocols active." The Magos opened fire on the demons, but he also fired at Strange when Strange got too close to the machine. The Magos would rather see the galaxy burn than turn off the holy archaeotech. Strange made a hard choice. He could not save everyone. He looked at Vorian. The captain was on the ground, wrestling with a pink horror that was giggling as it chewed on his arm. Strange cast a spell of sleep. A wave of purple dust washed over the guardsmen. They collapsed, unconscious. It saved them from killing each other, but it left them defenseless. Strange flew to the obelisk. He had to disable it manually. He landed on top of the black stone. The anti-magic burned his feet. He summoned the axe of Angarumus. He prepared to strike the control coupling. "Do not," Fate shouted. "Strange, look at the sensors." Strange paused. He looked at the holographic display projecting from the Magos' console. The pulse from the machine had cleared the sensor shadows. They could see orbit clearly now. The Chaos Fleet was moving. The Terminus Est was repositioning for a bombardment. But that wasn't what Fate was looking at. A new fleet had arrived at the edge of the system. Silver ships, sleek, silent, and shaped like crescents. Necrons. The Saltaic dynasty had been slumbering deep within the crust of Orestes. The null casket was not just a dampener. It was a prison lock for a Necron tomb complex. By activating it and sending that pulse, Strange hadn't just cleared the air. He had rung the doorbell. The ground beneath the cathedral began to shake. It was a rhythmic, mechanical tremor. Green lightning began to arc up from the floor plates. The Magos stopped firing. He looked down. His sensors screamed a warning. Xenos terminus signal detected, 7 Sigma said. There was fear in the monotone. We have awakened the old ones. The floor split open. A monolith began to rise. It was made of living metal glowing with necrotic energy. Scarab swarms poured out of the fissure like a carpet of steel beetles. They swarmed over the unconscious guardsmen. They didn't eat them. They analyzed them and discarded them. They were cleaning the floor for their masters. Strange realized the scale of his mistake. He had tried to fix a symptom, the plague, and in doing so, he had exacerbated the disease. He had turned a localized chaos incursion into a 3-way war between the Imperium, Chaos, and the Necrons. Fate landed beside him. The strategic chain reaction is complete, Fate said. We have escalated the conflict to a planetary extinction level. We need to leave, Strange said. Now, where is that train? The Magos controls it, Fate said. Strange looked at 7 Sigma. The Magos was busy trying to interface with the rising Necron monolith, blinded by greed for the alien tech. A Necron warrior rose from the pit. It raised a Gauss flare. It fired. The beam stripped the Magos' arm off, molecule by molecule. 7 Sigma shrieked, a very human sound. Open the train, Strange commanded, amplifying his voice with magic, or you die here with your prize. The Magos, clutching his stump, realized the logic. He transmitted the code. A heavy blast door at the back of the chamber hissed open. Behind it was a maglev carriage. Strange used the winds of Watum to scoop up the unconscious bodies of Vorian and the surviving guardsmen. He floated them into the train car. He grabbed the Magos with a magical tether and dragged him aboard. Fate followed, providing covering fire against the advancing Necrons. Strange slammed the door shut. He hit the launch sequence. The maglev engine engaged. The train shot forward into the dark tunnel, accelerating to 400 miles per hour in seconds. Behind them, the excavation chamber was consumed. The Necrons fully awoke. The Tzeentch demons attacked the Necrons. The two ancient enemies, the Warp and the Soulless, clashed over the prize of the null casket. The explosion of energies collapsed the cathedral. Inside the train, silence returned. Strange slumped against the wall. He was drained. He looked at the unconscious soldiers. He looked at Vorian, who was missing an ear and covered in demon blood. He looked at the Magos, who was leaking oil and chanting a repair liturgy. Fate stood by the window, watching the tunnel lights blur. The signal has gone out, Fate said. The Grey Knights will receive it. The High Lords will receive it. You have saved these 100 men for another day, Strange. But you have doomed this sector. Strange closed his eyes. He didn't answer. He knew Fate was right. He had acted with the heart of a hero, and the universe had punished him for it. He wondered if there was any right choice in this galaxy, or if every choice was just a different kind of damnation. The train hurtled towards the polar spaceport, carrying a broken wizard, a damaged robot, and a cargo of sleeping men who would wake up to a nightmare that had just gotten infinitely worse. The doctors were not the players. They were the catalyst, and the game had just begun. The maglev train decelerated with a grinding screech that vibrated through the metal bones of the carriage. The journey from the depths of the underhive to the northern polar cap had taken 6 hours of silent, terrifying velocity. Inside the carriage, the air was cold enough to freeze breath on the windows. Dr. Strange sat on the floor. He had not moved since the escape. He watched the unconscious forms of Captain Vorian and the remaining 80 guardsmen. They were wrapped in whatever cloth they could find. They looked like bundles of rags discarded by a careless giant. Strange felt the weight of the eye of Agamotto against his chest. It felt heavier than usual. The time stone was pulsing with a slow, irregular rhythm, reacting to the proximity of the Necron technology they had left behind. Strange knew he had tampered with forces that this universe had locked away for a reason. He had applied a bandage to a cancer, and the cancer had metastasized. Dr. Fate stood by the door as the train hissed into the terminal. His helmet was pristine, but the cape was tattered. Fate was calculating. He was running simulations of the next hour. The probability of a peaceful extraction was statistically negligible. He turned to Strange. He stated that the Magos was a liability. He suggested that they disable the tech priest before disembarking. Strange shook his head. He argued that they needed the Magos to navigate the machine spirits of the spaceport. Strange still believed in alliances. He still believed that a common enemy made friends of rivals. Fate did not argue. He simply adjusted his gloves. He knew that Strange would learn the lesson soon enough. The doors hissed open. The cold hit them like a physical blow. The polar spaceport of Orestes was a fortress built into the ice. It was a massive structure of black iron and grey stone, designed to withstand atmospheric re-entry and orbital bombardment. It was also a scene of absolute chaos. The platform was crowded with thousands of refugees. They were not the poor of the hive. They were the nobility. They were the minor guilders, the merchant princes, the administrators who had used their wealth to buy tickets on the last train north. They wore furs and silk stained with grease. They carried chests of gold thrones. They were screaming at the gate guards. The guards, members of the governor's household troops, were beating them back with shock maws. There were no ships leaving. The sky above the glass dome of the station was a swirling bruise of purple and green. The Chaos Fleet was bombing the equatorial cities, and the Necron pylons were firing green beams of Gauss energy into the clouds to intercept the ordnance. Margot 7 Sigma rolled out of the train. His optical sensors whirred. He did not look at the suffering humans. He looked at the data ports on the wall. He plugged a mechadendrite into a terminal. He spoke in binary. He hacked the local logistics grid. He announced that there was one void-capable transport in Hangar 4. It was a bulk lander, the Iron Mule, fueled and prepped for the governor's personal escape. The Magos suggested they commandeer it. Strange looked at the refugees. He asked if the ship could carry them. The Magos replied that the ship had a cargo capacity of 4,000 tons. It could carry everyone on the platform. Strange nodded. He felt a spark of purpose. He could save them. He could get these people off this dying rock. They moved through the crowd. Strange used a subtle spell of notice me not. The mob parted around them without realizing why. They reached the security checkpoint for the hangars. The blast doors were sealed. A line of automated turrets tracked their movement. Captain Vorian, who had awoken groggy and sick, limped forward. He still wore his ragged uniform. He looked at the clean, polished armor of the governor's troops on the other side of the glass. He slammed his fist against the barrier. He demanded entry in the name of the Imperial Guard. The troops inside laughed. They were safe. They had their orders. No one enters the governor's hangar. Strange stepped up. He dropped the illusion. He flared his cape. He gestured with his hand, and the heavy blast doors were torn from their hinges. The metal groaned and twisted, folding like paper. The troops inside raised their hell guns. Strange did not give them time. He cast the mists of Morpheus. A wave of blue vapor rolled over the soldiers. They slumped to the ground, asleep. Vorian looked at Strange. There was no gratitude in his eyes. There was only fear. Vorian knew that power like that was not natural, but he followed. The guardsmen followed. They had nowhere else to go. They entered Hangar 4. The Ahriman mule was a massive, ugly brick of a ship. It looked like a flying refinery. Servitors were loading crates of artwork and fine wines into the hold. The governor of Orestes, a fat man named Harkon, was shouting at his servants to move faster. He was trying to save his collection while his planet burned. When he saw the ragged guardsman and the two floating wizards enter his hangar, he shrieked. He pulled a gold-plated bolt pistol. He fired wildly. Fate caught the bolt around in mid-air. He crushed it between his fingers. He drifted toward the governor. Fate spoke. He said that the governor's authority was revoked by the laws of survival. The governor tried to run. Vorian's men caught him. They dragged him to the ground. They looked at the crates of wine. They looked at their own starving bodies. They looked at Vorian. Vorian nodded. The soldiers beat the governor to death with the butts of their laser guns. It was not justice. It was venting. Strange watched, revulsion rising in his throat. He started to intervene, to stop the brutality, but he saw the faces of the soldiers. If he stopped them, they would turn on him. He stayed silent. He was learning. Strange ordered the hangar doors opened. He told Vorian to get the refugees, all of them. Vorian hesitated. He said there were thousands. Strange said the ship would hold them. Vorian ran to the platform. He shouted that the ship was leaving. The mob surged. It was a stampede. People were trampled. Parents threw their children over the heads of the crowd. It was a panic fueled by the absolute certainty of death. Strange used his magic to widen the corridors, to create slides of energy to move people faster. He was managing the flow of a human river. Inside the ship, Margot 7 Sigma interfaced with the cockpit. He began the pre-flight rituals. He noted that the machine spirit of the vessel was old and stubborn. It required a sacrifice of sacred oil. The Magos drained his own internal reservoirs to appease the engine. The reactor shuddered to life. Then the sky broke. It was not the Chaos Fleet. It was not the Necrons. It was a teleportation flare. A vertical column of blinding blue light struck the center of the spaceport. The ferrocrete melted. The psychic shockwave shattered every window in the terminal. The refugees screamed and fell to the ground, clutching their ears. Strange felt it instantly. It was a psychic presence that felt like a hammer made of diamond. It was pure. It was rigid. It was the Imperium's answer. 5 figures materialized in the smoke. They stood 8 feet tall. Their armor was unpainted silver, engraved with gold text that hurt the eyes to read. They carried halberds that crackled with Nemesis force energy. Storm bolters were mounted on their wrists. They were the Grey Knights. They were the chamber militants of the Ordo Malleus. They were the demon slayers. And they had not come to evacuate refugees. The leader, Justicar Tancred, scanned the hangar. His helmet lenses glowed blue. He saw the mob. He saw the guardsmen. He saw the governor's corpse. He saw the 2 figures floating in the air. His threat assessment logic was instantaneous. He saw the warp signature on the guardsmen, the taint of the Nurgle fog they had breathed, the trauma of the Tinch illusions they had seen. He saw the alien geometry of fate. He saw the unbound sorcery of Strange. To a Grey Knight, there is no nuance. There is only purity and corruption. Exposure to the warp is a death sentence. To see a demon is to be contaminated. These people had seen too much. Tancred activated his voxcaster. His voice was a tectonic grind. He declared the site excommunicate. Traitores. He declared that the quarantine was absolute. He ordered his squad to cleanse the infection. Strange flew down to meet them. He held up his hands in the universal gesture of peace. He shouted that they were human. He shouted that they were survivors. He said they were leaving. Tancred did not debate. He raised his wrist-mounted stormbolter. He fired. The explosive rounds were psychically charged. They were designed to banish demons. When they hit Strange's shield, they didn't just impact, they tried to eat the magic. Strange staggered back. The shield held, but he felt a headache split his skull. These weren't bullets. They were prayers weaponized into mass reactive shells. "Wait," Strange yelled. "We fought the chaos. We are on your side." Tancred charged. He moved faster than the eye could follow. He was a transhuman biology enhanced by the Emperor's own genetic material. He swung his nemesis Force Halberd. Strange parried with a Talmandan shield. The collision created a shockwave that blew the nearest refugees apart. The halberd cut through the magic shield like it was glass. Strange barely dodged the blade. It sliced a lock of his hair. Fate intervened. He cast a beam of Unk energy at the Justiciar. The Grey Knight raised his hand. He did not dodge. He used his own psychic will, the Aegis, to block the spell. The gold light of Nabu crashed against the silver will of the Knight. It was a stalemate. Fate realized these men were different. They were resistant to magic because their minds were fortresses of blind faith. "Sorcery," Tancred spat. "You reek of the Imperium. Die, witch." The other 4 Grey Knights opened fire on the crowd. They were efficient. They aimed for density. The refugees, packed into the loading ramp, had nowhere to run. The bolter shells turned the ramp into a slaughterhouse. Men, women, children, it did not matter. To the Grey Knights, they were already dead. They were carriers of a plague that could destroy sectors. It was a mercy to kill them now before they spread the truth of the warp to other worlds. Vorian screamed. He ordered his guardsmen to fire. Last beams struck the silver armor. The shots did nothing. The Grey Knights didn't even flinch. One knight turned, raised a hand, and unleashed a psychic holocaust. White fire erupted from the floor. 20 guardsmen were incinerated instantly. Their souls were burned out of reality. Strange watched the massacre. He felt something break inside him. This was the help he had been waiting for. This was the Imperium. He realized then that there were no good guys in this galaxy. There were only different shades of monsters. He screamed in rage. He stopped holding back. He used the images of Ekon to create 1,000 duplicates of himself. He used the bolts of Balthak to rain lightning on the knights. He used the crimson bands to bind their arms. The Grey Knights struggled. They had never fought a sorcerer of this variety. Strange didn't use the warp. He used ambient mana. Their anti-demon wards were confused. Strange wrapped Tancred in red bands and slammed him into the ceiling. He pinned the other knights to the floor with gravity spells. Strange landed in front of Tancred. He held the axe of Angarumus to the knight's throat. "Stop," Strange roared. "Let them leave, or I will kill you." Tancred looked at the axe. He looked at Strange. He did not feel fear. He felt disgust. "Do it," the Justicar said. "Martyr me. It changes nothing. The orbit is mined. The Exterminatus has been authorized. You are saving meat for the grinder. You are weak." Strange hesitated. He was a doctor. He couldn't execute a man who was immobilized. In that moment of hesitation, the reality of the situation shifted again. The Magos 7 Sigma broadcasted a warning from the cockpit. Launch window closing. Tectonic destabilization imminent. Necron pylon network firing. Outside, the green beams from the Necron pylons converged. They struck the orbiting Chaos Fleet, but they also struck the debris field. The Necrons were not aiming for ships. They were aiming for the tear in the sky. The beams hit the Great Rift. They began to sew it shut. The reaction was cataclysmic. The sky turned white. Gravity on the surface reversed for 10 seconds. The Iron Mule was lifted off the ground by the gravity wave. The refugees who hadn't made it inside fell upward, screaming as they were pulled into the stratosphere to freeze or suffocate. The Grey Knights were pinned by Strange's magic, but the reversal of gravity broke his concentration. The bands faded. Tancred dropped to the floor. He didn't attack Strange. He looked at his auspex. He saw the Necron energy signature. He realized the Xenos threat was the priority. He made a tactical calculation. The transport ship was leaving. If it escaped, it would carry witnesses. But if he stayed to stop it, he would fail to deploy the cyclonic beacon to destroy the Necron tomb. Tancred looked at Vorian. The captain was standing by the airlock, trying to pull the last refugees inside. Tancred lunged. He didn't go for Strange. He went for the officer. He drove his halberd through Vorian's chest. Strange screamed. He blasted Tancred backward with a wave of pure force. He flew to Vorian. He caught the captain as he fell. Vorian looked up at Strange. Blood bubbled on his lips. "It's okay," Vorian whispered. He smiled. It was a sad, broken smile. "He's right. We saw too much. The Emperor protects." Vorian died. He died believing his murderer was righteous. Strange stared at the body. He felt cold. He looked at Tancred. The Justicar was regrouping with his squad. They were preparing to teleport out to move toward the Necron epicenter. They had done their job here. They had culled the herd. "Go," Tancred said to Strange. "Run into the void. The Inquisition will find you. There is nowhere to hide." The Grey Knights vanished in a flash of blue light. Strange was left alone in the hangar with the dead. The ramp was closing. The Muggles was firing the main thrusters. Strange stood there. He wanted to stay. He wanted to fight them all. He wanted to burn this universe down. Fate floated down. He grabbed Strange's arm. "We must go," Fate said. "The ship is launching." "They killed him," Strange whispered. "They just killed him." "They acted according to their programming," Fate said. "Come, or his death is meaningless." Strange let Fate pull him into the airlock. The heavy door sealed. The Iron Mule roared. It fought the gravity. It fought the atmosphere. It lumbered into the sky. Inside the hold, the scene was horrific. 2,000 refugees were crammed into a space meant for cargo. They were traumatized, covered in blood, weeping. They looked at Strange with terror. They had seen him fight the angels of death. They didn't see him as a savior anymore. They saw him as a reason why the angels had come. They backed away from him. Strange walked through the crowd. He felt their fear. It tasted like ash. He went to the cockpit. He sat in the co-pilot seat. He looked out the viewport. Below them, Orestes was dying. The Necron pylons were rising higher, turning the planet into a tomb world. The Chaos Fleet was retreating, battered by the Gauss fire. The Imperial fleet was holding distance, preparing for something else. Magos 7 Sigma plugged into the comms array. "Intercepting Vox traffic," the Magos said. "Inquisitor Kolsch has declared the planet lost. He has authorized the use of the 2-stage cyclonic torpedoes. He's going to blow up the planet," Strange asked. "Negative," the Magos corrected. "Cyclonic torpedoes ignite the atmosphere and crack the crust. He's going to shatter the world to deny it to the Necrons." Strange watched. He saw the fire streak down from the high orbit. It wasn't a beam. It was a small, physical projectile. It looked insignificant against the backdrop of the stars. It hit the equator. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the clouds caught fire. The fire spread globally in seconds. The atmosphere burned. The oceans boiled instantly. The planet turned into a ball of roiling flame. The shockwave radiated out into space. The Iron Mule was buffeted by the turbulence. The hull groaned. The radiation alarm screamed. They were riding the shockwave of a dying world. Strange watched Orestes burn. He watched the hive city, the trench lines, the underhive, the spaceport. All of it vaporized. The Grey Knights would have teleported to their cruiser. The Necrons would retreat into their tomb ships or be destroyed. The people were gone. Strange slumped in his seat. He covered his face with his hands. He had come to save. He had saved 2,000 people out of billions, and he had done it by holding a door open while fanatics slaughtered the rest. "We are in the void," Fate said. He was looking at the nav computer. "We have escaped the gravity well." "Where are we going?" Strange asked. His voice was cracked. "The Magos has a destination," Fate said. "Mars." Strange looked at the Magos. "Mars?" "Affirmative," Seven Sigma said. "I possess data on the Necron awakening. I possess the recording of the null casket interaction with your time manipulation device. This data is of infinite value to the Fabricator General. It will purchase our amnesty." "You want to give them the weapon?" Strange asked. "You want to give them the thing that started this?" "Knowledge is the only currency," the Magos said. "We require repair. We require resupply. Mars is the only port that can sustain us." Strange realized the trap. They were not refugees. They were contraband. The Magos wasn't saving them. He was delivering them as specimens. Strange looked at the refugees in the hold on the security monitor. They were huddled together, praying to the Emperor, who had just ordered their planet burned. Strange realized that he couldn't take them to Mars. If they went to Mars, the Mechanicus would turn them into servitors. They would be lobotomized and used as spare parts. "No," Strange said. "Not Mars. Calculations indicate no other viable trajectory," the Magos said. "Fuel reserves are insufficient for interstellar jumps. We must dock." Strange looked at the Eye of Agamotto. He looked at Fate. "Can you navigate the warp?" Strange asked. Fate paused. He looked at the swirling madness outside the window. "The warp is chaos. It is the antithesis of my nature. But I can see the threads of probability within it. We're not going to Mars," Strange said. "We're going to vanish." Strange stood up. He walked to the main console. He put his hand on the throttle. "Magos, set a course for the Mandeville Point. We're jumping." "Without a navigator?" the Magos queried. "Suicide. Probability of survival is 0. "I am the navigator," Strange said. He didn't feel confident. He felt desperate. He opened the eye. He projected his astral form out of the ship, into the void. He looked at the great rift. He looked at the currents of hell. He saw the demons waiting. He saw the madness. But he also saw a path. It was thin. It was winding. But it was there. "Fate, hold the ship together," Strange ordered. "Magos, keep the engines running. If you try to signal Mars, I will turn you into a toaster." The Magos considered the threat. He complied. The Iron Mule turned away from the Imperial fleet. It turned toward the tear in reality. The Inquisitor's ship saw them turn. They powered up their lances. They fired. "Punch it," Strange yelled. The ship accelerated. The void shields flared as lance strikes grazed the hull. They hit the translation point. The Geller field generator, an old and temperamental machine, kicked in with a scream of protest. Reality dissolved. The stars vanished. They were in the warp. Outside the viewports, colors that shouldn't exist swirled and screamed. Faces pressed against the glass, faces of demons, of lost souls, of things that hungered. Strange sat in the pilot's chair, his eyes glowing green. He was fighting the current. He was steering a brick through a hurricane of souls. He could feel the chaos gods watching him. Tzeentch was laughing. Nurgle was bubbling. Khorne was roaring. Slaanesh was whispering. They were interested. The Sorcerer Supreme had entered their playground. Strange gritted his teeth. He focused on one thing. The 2,000 heartbeats in the cargo hold. He would not let them die. He would find a safe harbor, even if he had to carve it out of the warp itself. This ended with the destruction of Orestes and the escape into the unknown. They had survived the fire, but now they were in the frying pan of the Imperium. And on the bridge of the Iron Mule, Dr. Strange realized that he was no longer a superhero. He was a captain of a ghost ship, drifting in a sea of monsters, with a crew that feared him and a universe that wanted him dead. The chronicler notes that this was the moment Stephen Strange began to understand the true horror of the 41st millennium. Survival is not a victory. It is merely a delay. The chronometer on the bridge of the Iron Mule read 0. It had read 0 for what felt like weeks, or perhaps seconds. In the Imperium, time is not a sequence. It is a fluid emotion, usually pain. Dr. Strange sat in the navigator's throne, a brass contraption designed for a mutant with a third eye, not a human wizard. He was wired into the ship's cogitator banks. His physical eyes were closed. His astral form was projected outside the hull, swimming through a sea of boiling colors. He saw things that defied description. He saw continents made of screaming faces. He saw stars that blinked like eyelids. He saw the great game of the Chaos Gods playing out in infinite dimensions. He was steering the ship by sheer will, using the eye of Agamotto as a lighthouse to cut through the fog of madness. Every hour, he had to mentally battle a daemon that tried to whisper coordinates into his mind. The demon promised safe harbor. It promised a world where the refugees would never hunger. Strange knew it was a lie. He pushed the ship deeper into the storm, looking for the currents of stability that Dr. Fate had predicted. Dr. Fate stood behind the throne. He was the anchor. If Strange was the sail, Fate was the keel. Fate used his order magic to reinforce the Geller field. The generator was failing. The machine spirit of the device was old and traumatized. It whimpered in binary. Fate soothed it with equations. He spoke of perfect circles and absolute zeros, feeding the machine the logic it craved to keep the barrier up there. But even Fate was tiring. The helmet of Naboo was heavy. The Lords of Order were distant here. This was the realm of their enemy. Fate looked at the refugees on the security monitors. They were huddled in the dark cargo hold. The emergency lights had failed. They were sitting in their own filth. They had stopped screaming. Silence in the warp is worse than screaming. It means the soul is beginning to accept the unacceptable. Magos 7 Sigma was the only one who was comfortable. He had deactivated his emotional subroutines. He was recording everything. He viewed the warp not as hell, but as a data set of uncalibrated physics. He was busy dissecting the corpse of a refugee who had died of heart failure. He was harvesting the organs to create nutrient paste for the survivors. It was a cold equation. One dead body could sustain 10 living ones for a day. Strange had forbidden it, but Strange was in a trance. The Magos did what was necessary. He fed the people their own dead, processed into grey bars, and he did not tell them what it was. On the 3rd day of the journey, the attack came. It was not a physical assault. It was a resonance. The hull of the Iron Mule began to vibrate. Dust fell from the ceiling. The vibration matched the frequency of the rubric of Ahriman. A ship appeared on the port side. It did not travel through the warp. It folded the warp around itself. It was a battle barge of the Thousand Suns, the Photep. It was magnificent and terrible. Its hull was blue and gold, covered in silver script that writhed like snakes. It was larger than a city. It dwarfed the refugee transport. Strange felt the presence immediately. It was a mind that rivaled his own. It was vast, ancient, and filled with a sorrow so deep it felt like gravity. A voice spoke in Strange's head. It was polite. It was cultured. "Greetings, practitioner. You are drifting. May I offer assistance?" Strange did not answer. He tried to steer away. The Photep matched his course. Tractor beams made of sorcerous energy lashed out. They were not green or blue. They were the color of memory. They grabbed the iron mule. The engines of the transport whined and died. The Magos reported total propulsion failure. The machine spirit had surrendered to a superior authority. "We are boarded," Fate said. He did not draw a weapon. He knew that physical force against this enemy was meaningless. He began to weave a warding spell, a complex lattice of mental defenses. The airlock did not cycle. It simply dissolved. A portal opened on the bridge. Mist poured out. It smelled of papyrus and ozone. Through the mist walked a figure. He was an Astartes, but he wore robes over his power armor. He carried a staff topped with the head of a jackal. His helmet was horned, a crest of gold that signified a high rank. He was Azek Ahriman, arch-sorcerer of the Thousand Suns, the exile, the seeker of the Black Library. He was accompanied by 2 rubric marines. They were silent automatons, empty suits of armor animated by the dust of their former souls. They stood like statues, bolters held across their chests. Ahriman looked at Strange. He looked at the eye of Agamotto. He did not attack. He lowered his staff. "I felt the ripple," Ahriman said. His voice came from the Vox grill, but it sounded human. "When you reversed time on the surface, it was inelegant, but potent. You are not of the Imperium. You are not of the warp. What are you?" Strange, disconnected from the nav throne. He stood up. He felt weak. His legs trembled. "I am Dr. Stephen Strange, Sorcerer Supreme of Earth, and I am just passing through." Ahriman chuckled. "Earth, holy terror. I have not walked its soil in 10,000 years. But you are not from my terror. Your psychic scent is different. A parallel timeline, a multiverse variant. Tzeentch loves such riddles." Ahriman walked closer. He looked at Fate. "And you? A lord of order. Nabu, yes. I have read of your kind in the scrolls of Babylon. You are far from home." "We require no assistance," Fate said. "Release the ship. We are carrying innocence." "Innocence," Ahriman mused. "There are no innocents, only resources." He turned back to Strange. "I do not want your ship. I do not want your refugees. I want you to look at something." Ahriman waved his hand. The reality of the bridge peeled away. Strange and Fate were suddenly standing on the surface of a world that was burning. It was Prospero, the city of light. Strange saw the white pyramids. He saw the great libraries. He saw the space wolves descending, burning the books, slaughtering the scholars. He felt Ahriman's pain. It was a raw, open wound. "I tried to save them," Ahriman whispered. "I cast a spell to stop the flesh change. I tried to fix my brothers, and I turned them into dust." The vision shifted. Strange saw the rubric marines crumbling. He saw the horror of the Legion. "I made a mistake. A variable was incorrect. I have spent millennia seeking the correction. The Black Library denies me. The Webway fights me. But you You carry a stone that commands time. Strange understood. You want the eye. You want to go back. I want to undo it, Ahriman said. The vision faded. They were back on the bridge. I can help you. I can guide this ship to a paradise world within the Eye of Terror, a place where your refugees will be scholars, not slaves, where they can learn the arts. I will give them purpose. In exchange, you will lend me the stone. Just for one ritual, I will return to the moment of the rubric. I will change one word in the incantation, and I will save my brothers. It was the unavoidable offer. It was the temptation that Strange had faced before, but never with these stakes. Ahriman was not a villain in the traditional sense. He was a man trying to fix a mistake that had damned his family. Strange looked at the rubric Marines. He saw the tragedy. He saw the dust inside the armor. If you change the past, Strange said, you break the present. You know this. The paradox will destroy reality. Reality is already broken, Ahriman shouted. His composure cracked. Look around you. The galaxy is a corpse being eaten by maggots. The Imperium is a rotting carcass. Chaos is a cancer. What is there to save? Let us rewrite it. Let us make it better. The cost, Fate interjected. Entropy requires balance. To save your legion, you would have to sacrifice something of equal value. What is the price, Ahriman? The souls of these refugees, the soul of this universe. Ahriman hesitated. Everything has a price. Tzeentch demands it, but I am smarter than the god. I can cheat the bargain. No one cheats the bargain, Strange said. He thought of his own battles. He thought of the times he had used the time stone. It always came back to bite him. I cannot give you the stone. It is not mine to give. It belongs to the order of the masters of the mystic arts. I am its guardian, not its owner. Ahriman's demeanor cooled. The desperation vanished, replaced by the cold arrogance of an arch-sorcerer. Then you are a fool, and I will take it from your corpse. Ahriman raised his staff. A bolt of blue fire, darker than void, shot towards Strange. Strange blocked it with a shield, but the impact drove him backward. The fire splashed against the shield and turned into acid. It began to eat the magical energy. Ahriman was using the warp to corrupt the mana. Fate stepped in. He fired a beam of golden energy. Ahriman deflected it with a gesture. The beam hit the console, exploding a bank of cogitators. Your order is static, Ahriman laughed. Chaos is change. Chaos is evolution. The bridge became a battlefield, Strange and Fate against Ahriman. But Ahriman was on his home ground. The warp amplified his power. He summoned mirror images of himself. He turned the floor into quicksand. He turned the air into glass shards. Strange fought back. He used the 7 rings of Ragador to bind the rubric Marines. He used the flames of the 14 to burn away the illusions. But the ship was taking damage. The hull groaned. The Geller field flickered. Stop, Strange yelled. You'll destroy the ship. The people will die. Then give me the stone. Ahriman roared. He was levitating now, surrounded by a halo of psychic lightning. Strange looked at the Magos. 7 Sigma was cowering under a console, trying to protect the navigation data. Strange had an idea. It was risky, it was insane, but it was the only card he had. Magos, Strange shouted, drop the Geller field. The Magos looked at him. Illogical. Structural integrity will fail. Demonic incursion probability 100%. Do it, Strange commanded. Now. Strange didn't wait for the Magos. He used a telekinetic blast to smash the Geller generator. The field collapsed. The warp rushed in. It wasn't just radiation. It was entities. Dozens of screamers of Tzeentch, flying, ray-like demons made of teeth and eyes, phased through the hull. They shrieked. They didn't attack Strange. They attacked the biggest psychic beacon in the room. They attacked Ahriman. Ahriman was a champion of Tzeentch, but he was also a rival. The demons of his own god hated him. They swarmed him. They bit at his armor. They entangled his staff. Ahriman cursed. He had to divert his attention from Strange to fend off the creatures of his own master. "You are mad," Ahriman screamed, as he incinerated a screamer. "You have doomed us all." "I'm a doctor," Strange yelled. "Sometimes you have to stop the heart to save the patient." Strange grabbed a Fate. "Now, we use the breach. The warp currents are turbulent because of the fight. We can ride the wake of his ship." Strange grabbed the controls of the Iron Mule. He didn't steer it. He aimed it. He aimed it directly at the portal Ahriman had opened. He aimed it at the Photep. "Collision imminent," the Margot stated calmly. "We're not hitting it," Strange said. "We're drafting." Strange used the Eye of Agamotto not to change time, but to freeze it for the ship. He created a bubble of static time around the Iron Mule. For a microsecond, the ship existed outside of the warp's flow. He pushed the throttle to maximum. The Iron Mule shot forward. It passed through the portal, grazing the shields of the Photep. The feedback loop was massive. The energy of the two ships interacting caused a tear in the warp itself, a localized wormhole. Ahriman saw them escaping. He reached out with a psychic hand to grab them. But the screamers were overwhelmed him. He had to choose, the stone or his life. He chose life. He detonated a psychic pulse to clear the demons. In that second of distraction, Strange slipped the leash. The Iron Mule was sucked into the wormhole. The transition was violent. The ship was stretched like taffy. Strange felt his soul being pulled thin. He heard the laughter of Tzeentch. The god was amused. The Sorcerer Supreme had used chaos to defeat chaos. It was a joke the Changer of Ways appreciated. They were spat out of the warp. Real space. The silence was deafening. The engines were dead. The power was out. Strange lay on the floor of the bridge, bleeding from his nose and ears. Fate was kneeling, his helmet dull. The Magos was rebooting. Strange crawled to the viewport. He expected to see stars. He saw nothing. Just blackness. Infinite, empty blackness. "Where are we?" Strange whispered. Fate stood up. He walked to the window. He looked at the stars, or rather, the lack of them. He identified the constellations, but they were wrong. They were faint, distant. "We are beyond the Astronomicon," Fate said. "We are beyond the range of the Emperor's light." "The ghoul stars?" Strange asked. "Further," Fate said. "We are in the halo zone, the galactic rim. We are alone." Strange looked at the sensors. There were no planets, no suns nearby, just a drifting hulk of a space station, ancient and dark, rotating slowly in the void. It looked like a ribcage made of iron. "What is that?" "Unknown," 7 Sigma said. "Architecture matches no known Imperial pattern. Pre-human." "It's a shelter," Strange said. "We have no fuel. We have no food. We have to dock." They maneuvered the Iron Mule with the last dregs of battery power. They latched onto the station. The airlocks connected. The seal held. They entered the station. It was huge. Miles of corridors. It was empty. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, just dust. But the air was breathable. And deep in the core, there was a geothermal tap, a heat source. Strange walked through the silent halls. He felt the weight of the decision he had made. He had rejected Ahriman's offer. He had saved the timeline, but at what cost? They were exiled. They were outside the map. They found a central chamber. It was a dome with a view of the intergalactic void. Strange stood there. Vorian was dead. The refugees were traumatized survivors of a hell run. The Magos was a machine who viewed them as meat, and Fate was a cosmic entity who saw this as a strategic position. Strange realized this was their new home. They weren't going back to Earth. They weren't going back to the Imperium. They were the founders of a new colony in the dark. Strange went down to the cargo hold. The doors opened. The smell of fear and sickness rolled out. The refugees looked up. They saw the man in the blue cloak. They didn't cheer. They watched him with wary eyes. "We're here," Strange said. His voice was tired. "It's safe. There are no demons. There are no inquisitors. Just us." A woman stood up. She held a baby. "Where is here?" she asked. "The beginning," Strange said. He turned and left. He couldn't look at them. He knew that safe was a lie. In 40K, nothing is safe. But it was quiet. Strange returned to the bridge. He sat in the captain's chair. He took off the Eye of Agamotto. He placed it on the console. It pulsed weakly. "We need a plan," Strange said to Fate. "We establish a perimeter," Fate said. "We secure the station. We cultivate the algae tanks we passed on level 4. We survive. And then we prepare," Fate said. "The signal we sent on Orestes. Ahriman wasn't the only one who heard it. We have made ourselves a target. They will come for us. Maybe not today. Maybe not in 100 years. But they will come." Strange looked at the dark void. He realized his war wasn't over. It had just changed. He was no longer an avenger. He was a warlord of the Halo stars. He would have to be harder, colder. He would have to become something this universe respected. "Let them come," Strange said. He raised his hand. He cast a spell, not a shield, not a weapon. He cast a spell of concealing. He wrapped the station in a shroud of shadow, hiding it from the psychic eyes of the galaxy. It was a massive expenditure of energy. It turned his hair grey at the temples. It aged him 10 years in a second. But the station vanished from the map. "We are ghosts now," Strange said. Magos 7 Sigma approached. "Fabricator General Protocol suspended. I require a new directive." Strange looked at the machine. "Learn," Strange said. "Study the magic. Study the warp. Find a way to mix it with your tech. If we're going to survive out here, we need weapons that the Imperium calls heresy." The Magos' optic cycled. "Compliance. The restrictions of Mars are irrelevant here. Innovation is authorized." This was the final turning point. Strange had authorized tech heresy. He had broken the oldest law of the Mechanicus. He was building a kingdom of outcasts. Fate nodded. He understood. Order required structure, even if that structure was built on forbidden ground. 3 of them stood in the dark station, drifting at the edge of the universe. The sorcerer, the demigod, and the heretic machine. Below them, 2,000 broken humans began to set up camp into the ruins. This ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, terrifying realization that to survive in the 41st millennium, you must become something the old you would have fought. Dr. Strange had saved his people, but he had lost his way home forever. He was now a lord of the fringe, and the darkness was his only ally. The data fragment known as the Halo Protocol was discovered 3 centuries after the fall of Orestes. It was found in the wreckage of a rogue trader vessel drifting near the Mandeville point of the Calixis sector. The log was written by Captain Harrigan Voss, a man known for mapping the dark spaces where the Astronomicon does not shine. Voss wrote of a kingdom hidden in the asteroid belt of the Halo stars. He described a station that defied the laws of the Mechanicus. He spoke of a place where the hull plates were inscribed with glowing geometric runes that burned the eyes of the uninvited. He called it the Sanctum of the Silent. Voss recorded that his ship was intercepted, not by the Imperial Navy, but by sleek, silent drones that combined the aesthetics of ancient terror with the forbidden curves of Xenos technology. He was not boarded by force. He was hailed by a voice that sounded like grinding gears. He was granted permission to dock for trade. What he found inside the station terrified him more than the orcs or the Eldar. He found a human society that was healthy. The people were well fed. They were educated. They did not cower in the mud. But the price of their health was their soul. Every citizen of the station wore a small amulet of silver circuitry. They were all low-level psychers, trained in the rudiments of mental shielding. They were a society of witches, disciplined by fear and necessity. Voss met their rulers. He described a figure sitting on a throne of floating basalt. The man was ancient. His hair was white, his face lined with the stress of holding back 1,000 nightmares. He wore a blue cloak that seemed to be woven from the fabric of the void itself. He did not speak of the Emperor. He spoke of the equations of survival. He traded Voss a crate of bolt rounds. These were not standard mass-reactive shells. They were etched with sigils of order. When Voss tested one later, the round did not just kill a target. It erased the target's presence from the warp. The man on the throne introduced himself simply as the Doctor. He asked for news of Earth. When Voss told him that the Indomitus crusade was faltering, the Doctor did not weep. He simply nodded, as if confirming a diagnosis he had made long ago. Hovering above the throne was a golden entity. Voss described it not as a man, but as a construct of pure psychic law. It did not speak. It simply observed. It was the station's Geller field. It was the wall that kept the demons of the Halo stars at bay. The people called it the Fate Weaver. They worshipped it not as a god, but as a necessary function of the universe, like gravity or heat. And in the shadows of the throne room, Voss saw the machine monsters. They were servitors, but they retained their human intelligence. They were voluntary cyborgs, priests of a new mechanicum that believed innovation was the highest form of prayer. Their leader was a sprawling mass of mechadendrites who referred to himself as the Prime Factor. The report concludes with Voss leaving the system. He was allowed to leave, but he was given a warning. The Doctor told him that if he revealed the coordinates of the sanctum to the Inquisition, the station would vanish. He said they were not hiding to save themselves. They were hiding to build an arsenal. The Doctor claimed that he was preparing for a war that the Imperium did not even know was coming. Voss noted that as his ship pulled away, he looked back at the station. It was surrounded by a cloud of debris. Upon magnification, he realized the debris was not rock. It was the broken hulls of Tyranid bioships, Necron tomb barges, and Chaos cruisers. The sanctum had killed them all. The Inquisition sealed the Voss report. It was classified as heresy extremis. The coordinates were purged from the databanks. But deep within the archives of the Ordo Malleus, there is a subfile. It lists the sanctum not as a target, but as a quarantine asset. The Imperium knows that something is out there in the dark, holding the line. They do not know it is two lost heroes from another reality, slowly losing their humanity